Hello, and welcome to the Mapping the Doctrine of Discovery podcast. The producers of this podcast would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And now, introducing your hosts, Philip Arnold and Sandra Bigtree.
Welcome, everyone, to Mapping the Doctrine of Discovery. I'm Phil Arnold, professor in the Department of Religion and core faculty in Native American Indigenous Studies at Syracuse University, the founding director of the Scano Great Law Peace Center, and board member of Indigenous Values Initiative.
And I'm Sandy Bigtree, a citizen of the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne. I'm on the board as well of the Indigenous Values Initiative and was part of the founding collaborative of the Scano Great Law Peace Center.
And this podcast is brought to you by the Henry Luce Foundation. And we're coming to you from Onondaga Nation territory. Our guest tonight is Tina Ngata, coming to us all the way from New Zealand. And Tina, I want you to introduce yourself, but I also want you to introduce our listeners to your name for what we call New Zealand.
Sure. So tēnā koutou. My name is Tina Ngata. I am a Ngāti Porou wahine. So Ngāti Porou is the name of my nation, and we hail from the East Cape of Te Ika a Maui. Te Ika a Maui, the colonizer name of which is the North Island of Aotearoa is the name of our nation, of our country, and the colonizer name for that is New Zealand. Aotearoa means the long white cloud. And so that's me. I live here on our whenua, which has been held by our land, my own lands, which have been held by our family and our nation for time immemorial. And I work largely in COVID response, and my other area that I work in is anti-racism with a specific focus on anti-colonial racism and imperialism. And of course, this also includes a lot of work around the doctrine of discovery. So really honored to be here with you all to be able to contribute to the discussion. And very thankful for all of the work that you've done, which we've utilized over in Aotearoa here as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe, most of our guests have been from Turtle Island, from North, South, Central America. Can you talk about, from your perspective, how do you define the doctrine of Christian discovery? How does it affect you today? What do you see as the kind of really critical elements in Aotearoa?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, the way that I've approached the doctrine of discovery, there's kind of two, I guess, defining elements for it. One is that it's an international legal principle. And it has come to determine particularly international relations. And when I say international, I mean between my nation as Ngāti Porou and other nations as well, as nation states as they've been defined by colonizers. And so it's an international legal concept that started off and was incepted with a series of papal bulls. But throughout time, and I think this is a really important thing to understand, throughout time it has become entrenched within the larger social psyche. And by the social psyche, I mean the implicit and explicit rules that influence how we relate to each other and how we perceive our roles within society and our roles in relation to each other. The explicit rules, of course, are represented by legislature and laws and policies, and some of the implicit rules are in like social contracts around what we deem to be acceptable and what we deem to be heroic and what we deem to be unacceptable. And some of those things are influenced through education, through media, and just established norms as well. And so the doctrine of discovery, while it started off as a series of papal bulls, which collectively had a particular impact and intention to aid in European imperial expansion, over time embedded themselves within the social psyche and became powerful influences across many spaces. And a lot of that happened through, as I mentioned, education, but also intellectualism as well. And these are a lot of the spaces that I work in to try and, one, expose it, and then two, dismantle its impacts.
Well, up here we deal with primary texts and the first recorded histories written by the Jesuits who came in the early 17th century. And within, in the Jesuit relations, they talk about within 30 years, they transformed the matriarchy into the patriarchy. And women were deemed the firebrands of hell in the relations, and they were targeted first and foremost. So this social psyche goes right to the very core of our own identity and Christian indoctrination on who we are as human beings on this earth. I was reading about this, couples were forced to marry, and the women were forced to accept the vow of obedience to the male. And they're talking about this 30 years into this process, but already all these people had Christian names. And in the books, nowhere is it written really where their Indian names, their clan names were being used. So it's like right from the moment of contact, they knew how to dismantle the culture right from the inside. And although they say, they never came with weapons, they came with like penance, punishing individuals, withholding shelter, withholding food. And these are like the very basic fundamental attacks. Right from the beginning.
Sorry. Yeah, absolutely. And if you have a look at particularly the text from some of those early documents like El Requerimiento, that it talks very clearly about submitting to the yoke of the cross and the crown. And in the early stages, when the doctrine of discovering these papal bulls were developed, of course, the separation of church and state had not yet been advanced. And so the two things were one. And you saw in the text like El Requerimiento that they made commitments which were along the lines of, if you do not submit to the yoke of the cross and the crown, if you do not accept our Christian God as the God, if you do not submit yourselves as our servants or submit to the monarch, then we will take your women and we will take your children and we will do unto them such mischief as we may. And so, this was something that was read out, obviously, to people who didn't even understand the language in which it was being read. It was often read out before they even saw land. So it wasn't even within earshot. It was a basic technicality that sometimes they stood on the deck of their ship and read out from a distance. But deeply religious and very explicit in its intention to do harm to women and children, which in that indicates a level of appreciation for just how fundamentally destructive it was to a society to attack these two very sacred aspects of the primary unit of the family unit of a community, that being women and children, within as much as I struggle with people talking about moral war or the ethics of warfare, but in many cases it's accepted that women and children should be sheltered in those days, and in the earlier days, that women and children should be sheltered, and that warfare was the business of soldiers. And they were very clear that not just women warriors to the side, that the most vulnerable members of the community were not out of bounds, and in fact nothing was out of bounds in that space. The other thing to remember when we consider that is particularly when we look at the full name, the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, is the role of desanctification, the role of defiling, the role of making something not sacred, because when you make it not sacred, it becomes consumable. You're able to turn it into a consumable. Mm-hmm. And the way I've seen the Doctrine of Discovery also, it's that it's always been an economic project, an opportunist economic project. So it used the most powerful validating force, which at the time was religion. And so when you make something less sacred, you can turn it into a consumable, you can enslave it, you can turn it into something for your profit. And we see that language, the use of the term profit, as early as in Romanus Pontifex. It talks about, committing people to perpetual servitude or perpetual slavery for his or her use and profit. And the exploitation and extraction from Indigenous lands, waters, and bodies, and over time minds, has really been a driver of the Doctrine of Discovery. And the desanctification, making people less sacred, making people consumable, making people your property, is a fundamental step in that process.
Right. And that's what brings it right into the present, because we're under that system. Everybody is living on the earth today. They fall under, accept that domination and authority that is hierarchically above them, and they feel they have to obey, this higher order, which is,
that's right.
Which separates us from being part of this great mystery and regenerative life force.
That's right. And you look up to the sky for the Christian God sitting on his throne in a cloud, in order to be closer to them and further away from our mother underneath our feet. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that it's a way of disconnecting us also from our connection to Papa Tuanuku, our mother earth. Mm-hmm. As well. And looking at this, even just looking at it as a hierarchy rather than a family tree, which is how we look at it. We call it the Wakapapa, which is a genealogical web of connection to all creatures on this planet, and also not just to all creatures, but to the ocean, to the trees, to everything on the planet, to rocks as well. We have these genealogical connections right throughout the planet. And so you contrast that with the Christian dogma of the time, which was the great chain of being, where you had an old man with a big beard on a throne, usually with a cherub on his lap, and surrounded by archangels, underneath which are regular angels. They even had 2 layers for the angels alone. And then underneath that, the monarchs of Europe, and then underneath that, the peasantry. And then there were, I believe, they had fish and birds and mammals, and then underneath that, trees and rocks, and then underneath that, demons, and the devil and hell. And Indigenous peoples, well, non-European peoples, generally we're within those lower levels, if not hell, then at best mammals or animals as well throughout the experience of the doctrine of discovery. So, and that's still at play today, you know, for people to say that the separation of church and state mean that there's no longer any relevance for the church in this discussion. Well, I don't know how it is for you, but the church opens our government every year, and the church holds still now vast tracts of stolen Maori land and millions and millions of dollars worth of assets that it accrued through this process of colonization that it still retains today. And it holds, of course, a seat at the United Nations. The Holy See has a seat at the United Nations. And it has, you know, distinct audience with our Prime Minister. It holds a regular distinct audience with our Prime Minister, church leaders do. And I know that that's the case in many other places as well. And so they still hold quite a significant amount of influence, as well as still retaining the legacy of the doctrine of discovery as well. And there's definitely a reckoning for many of them to take. And some of them have started that pathway. And I've had some very profound discussions with some church leaders who are reckoning with their own history and the doctrine of discovery, and that's fantastic. But by and large, it's not being done. And often what happens is that they will try and distract from that reckoning with other arguments.
Right. Right. No, I mean, what you're indicating here to me is the incredible violence that we're surrounded with on a kind of daily basis that goes without comment, you know, just living in a consumer society, you know, who speaks for those living beings that, you know, this is an old, you know, old kind of sentiment for the Haudenosaunee. Who speaks for the eagles? Who speaks for the buffalo, for the trees, right? And so this kind of consumerist violence is almost, you know, it can't be, it really can't be identified and can't be acknowledged on a day-to-day basis. But going back to something that Sandy was bringing up, I think too, something that you've been working on too, is violence against women. That is going on today, particularly Indigenous women around the world. You know, somewhere on that great chain of being, around where maybe just above animals or something like that, are women, right? And probably people of color. So talk to us about how the doctrine of discovery becomes kind of one of those building blocks in violence against Indigenous women, and, you know, how you're, you know, trying to address it, connecting those dots, if you can.
Sure. So a number of years ago, and I want to give a shout out to some of my sisters that I've shared this space with, including, or this discussion with, including Betty Lyons and Beverly Jacobs and our sister Sandra Creamer as well, and Dawn Martin Hill. And so quite a few years ago, actually, we held an event in New York during the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues on the doctrine of discovery and its impact upon Indigenous women as well. And here in Aotearoa, we have just been working through the Waitangi Tribunal, which is our treaty tribunal, our nationwide treaty tribunal. They investigate violations of our treaty, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And the hearings that you generally have, there's more or less two kinds of hearings that you have in relation to that. And one is hearings for historical grievances against iwi, against nations, and that will include, you know, land theft and all sorts of, you know, abuse through the colonial project that have happened to nations. And the other types of hearings that you hear are what we call kaupapa. So that is about particular issues where the treaty, the articles and provisions of the treaty have been violated by the Crown. And so the work that I've been doing very recently has been, I was invited to provide evidence to the tribunal around the violations in relation to wahine Māori women, as a part of the Mana Wahine Tribunal claim, which is a claim in relation to those, the violations of the treaty for Māori women. And the area that I was asked to give evidence to was in relation to the doctrine of discovery. So that was to really compare the claims happen in stages. So the first stage is the tuapapa hearings, and the tuapapa hearings are purely to discuss what life was like before the signing of the treaty. And then the next stage of the hearings are the impact hearings, which is after the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and the violations then happened. How did that impact upon wahine Māori and Māori in general? And so I was invited to speak particularly to the reality before the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in relation to the doctrine of discovery. And to do that, I compared colonial treatment of European women over those centuries, and compared that to how women featured in Māori society over the centuries leading up to the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in 1840. And so that was a few weeks ago now that the hearings took place. And the evidence that I gave was along the lines of what we've already discussed around the way in which, women were already well recognized as being a fundamental building block of Māori society. And so it was identified very early and also observed overseas that when you target women, that is a fast track to dismantling an Indigenous community. And so it was talking about yes, we can talk about the impacts, but it's really important to talk about the intent. And so I demonstrated that there was a clear present intent on behalf of the colonizers to target women as a part of the colonial project. For us, where I am in my nation, we're often described as a matrilineal culture. Women were definitely the dominant landholders, and land was passed down through female lines more often than not. And all of our meeting houses, the majority of our meeting houses are named after women. If the meeting houses are not named after women, then the dining halls attached to them are, or the marae, the meeting space in front, a very important ceremonial space, will be named after a woman ancestor of ours. We were leaders, we were ocean navigators, we were military strategists, and horticulturalists and economists. So looking at, we held our own schools as well at a time when in Europe it was not legal for women to attend school. We ran our own schools of learning, of sacred learning. We were also tohunga, spiritual leaders, priests, I guess would be the term as well, where that was not allowed. And so, when colonizers arrived here, it was such a stark contrast to their reality. And they understood that that was definitely something that needed to change, both in the interests of assimilation, but also to destabilize the Indigenous communities that they were coming across here in Aotearoa.
Well, 10,000 years ago or so, the Haudenosaunee had fallen away from their duties and responsibilities and maintaining this balance in the natural world. So they came and fell under warfare, and it was extremely violent. And that's when the peacemaker came to Onondaga Lake here in Haudenosaunee territory, among the Onondaga Nation specifically. And when he arrived, the first person he encountered was a woman. So she was, targeted in this sense to help bring and restore balance back among the people. And her responsibility, the woman he came upon was, she had a lodge and she would feed all the soldiers because her family was divided, and she loved both sides because even though they were fighting against one another, she was related to them and still loved them. So she would feed them and provide lodging. And the peacemaker told her, this is not going to help. You have a very big heart, and I know you're dedicated to do something. So this is what you need to do. And that was to follow his instructions and gather a certain number of women and follow the protocol of the peacemaker. And they had to go live in the forests. And in time, certain animals would appear to each woman, and that would mark her new clan identity. And so this reestablished balance among the Haudenosaunee because of the special reconnection with the natural world. And then through this process, it would be the women who would then select their loyani, which is not a hierarchical chief. A loyani is a man of the good mind. And because the women raised these children, she knew, these children from birth who could, respect such a title. So it did start with the women, and then it moved on to Hiawatha, where grief was acknowledged, because in warfare there's a lot of grief. So the absolution of grief became a major tenet of restoring this peace as well. But it's, then the Jesuits come and just target these women who were the toughest women they had encountered. They were not going to relinquish who they were to a Christian God. So it took them 30 years to try to tame them. They never did fully, obviously, because we're still fighting, but it's interesting. They knew exactly, the colonists knew exactly, they had to target the women. They bring all life into this earth, all human life come through the women. So it is a matrilineal line,
It absolutely,
Mhm.
yeah, yes, it absolutely is. And was just discussing with one of my relations the other day around how, there's writings from colonizers. One thing I'm thankful for them is that at least they wrote a lot. And I think, when they wrote about the things that they found acceptable at the time. Of course, they didn't foresee that in the future it would come to be deeply unacceptable. But at the time, at least they were open about the things that they were thinking. And so one of the things that I'm referring to was that they wrote about how important it is to utilize Maori women to sow the seeds of colonization within communities as well. Boy, was that a bad call, because wahine Māori have been at the forefront of colonial resistance, and so that was a real missed call, that they thought that they could focus for a short while, focus on Māori women as being the ones who would sell colonization to the broader community. But yeah, they really did have an understanding of our power in that space, but also our sacredness in that space. And I think I used the term vulnerability earlier before. It's possibly not the best term to use. Probably the better term to use is sacredness, that you attack the most sacred and sacrosanct parts of a community. And really, nothing was sacred to the colonizers. Nothing was sacrosanct to the colonizers, and we've seen that play out both, through, of course, horrible residential schools and uplifts and theft of Indigenous children all around the world, as well. And so, yeah, definitely it's been a part of, they understand them. They understand their sacredness, they understand their importance, and that's why they targeted them.
It's ironic, the Jesuits come in and they're like preaching that the blood of martyrs are the seeds of change. They're not actual seeds, mind you, they're ideological seeds. You know, it's they take the language or these concepts and use them to dominate. It's interesting.
It's very similar in many ways to your situation in Aotearoa. So what I'd like to do is switch gears a little bit, because you wrote this brilliant piece, and I want to highlight this for a minute because, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Before we do switch gear, you just said something that around, you know, the fact that, you know, it's very similar, and there's a reason why it's very similar.
Good.
We took from the playbook that was utilized on your land. James Cook, who incepted colonialism, served under Field Marshal Geoffrey Amherst. Amherst was Cook's mentor during the 7-Year War. He learnt about germ warfare, and Joseph Banks, who accompanied Cook on the Endeavour when they invaded here and called it Discovery. And he also was a part of the 7-Year War and over in Canada. And they were actually called back from the St. Lawrence River, where they had been handing out infected kerchiefs and infecting local Mohawk communities. They were called back from there to man the Endeavour and bring it out across the Pacific. And of course, some of our judges drew from Johnson v. McIntosh to set precedents, and so there was a transplanting of jurisprudence in relation to the doctrine of discovery here. So we were big note swappers, which is why there was so much correlation between our experiences. And I wanted to say that because I think it's something that it unites us as well in our struggles when we talk about these connections. Yeah,
I'll add to that a little bit too, because these issues are not just like 200, 300, 400 plus year old crazy religion talk, right? Or some kind of concept that has, you know, was born in the minds of these rabid colonists at a certain time in history. These are very much with us now, and they should be addressed. Of course, they're being addressed by Indigenous people. That the urgency of that is right in your communities, in the communities that we deal with regularly, but also non-native allies, will say, non-Indigenous allies, and whatever that means, I'm one of those, then you know, it's important that we be engaged in this work as well. I mean, we call this the two-row wampum methodology, right? That you know, essentially we have our own work in our own lanes, you could say, or in our own vessels that need to be coordinated in some way. Because, you know, just to put, I can say this because I'm a white person, white people don't know about this legacy that they embody on a daily basis. And they don't really appreciate the urgency of it, you know, the urgency of that is connected to climate change, is connected to, you know, the overthrow of our government, or all kinds of, you know, issues that we're currently, you know, involved with right now on the ground. So when, you know, as you were speaking before, when you introduce these ideas to non-Indigenous students of the doctrine of discovery as well, now the Indigenous students come in to the class, they already know about it, they've heard about it, they know about it. But non-Indigenous students, we'll say settler colonial students, when they hear about it, it kind of focuses and helps them understand the problem, you know, a foundational element of the problem they might be feeling in some way, but
Identify.
don't really have the language for it because they don't have that connection, that immediate connection in their own communities. So I just wanted to mention that as well, because when you talk about the legacy moving around the world, and this is part of, the issue we're dealing with as well in this podcast is how do we grapple with this global phenomenon that has manifestations in very different ways, but it's a similar kind of foundation. We also need to bring along these other, non-Indigenous settler colonial allies in some ways.
Oh, absolutely. Like as you've stated, that this extends into existential issues for everybody on the planet Earth. And it's important that we do that so that people understand you're not just doing this to do Indigenous peoples a favor. These are deep existential issues that will impact the futures of everybody on the planet. You have a look at the way in which corporate behavior and almost what you would call the doctrine of discovery, the corporate doctrine of discovery, it takes its playbook from imperial corporate behavior as well, that foundational imperative of profit that's embedded within Romanus Pontifex and has continued to be a core theme throughout time, that's lasted and still lasts today, which is when you come down to it, the economy continues to be the main confounder of Indigenous justice today. Why can't we get Indigenous land back? It would cause economic instability is generally what it comes back to as well. And a lot of the abuse of Indigenous rights usually comes down to economic drivers. Even, the power grabs usually are there in order to serve a particular ends, right? And those ends are generally economic ends, and which is why I say the doctrine of discovery has always been an economic project. It was always about channeling wealth from Indigenous lands, waters, and bodies and minds for the benefit of European nations, but also now for the benefit of Europeans who sit at the apex of the racial hierarchy or the power hierarchy as well. The other thing to remember is that, when you look at that great chain of being as being almost like a scaffolding for that hierarchy of power, you look at where women sit within it relative to other groups, but also you look at how class features into it as well. And the people who are ultimately serviced by this hierarchy of power is actually a very small percentage of white people. It's the elite. It's the cis, hetero, fully abled, neurally normative, all of the things that go into making somebody the most privileged, that sit at the apex. And so challenging this power hierarchy that has been put in place through the doctrine of discovery is something that also holds benefits for all races, acknowledging that race is a construct, but for all races, for all ethnicities, for all peoples as well.
Right from the onset, there were great orators from the Americas that would travel to Europe and critique their social structures. How you expect us to accept Christianity when we have no hierarchy? You're all under some kind of domination of your God or your king or monarch. We don't have that. We live freely. And there are some scholars today that are attributing the whole Enlightenment era to these Indigenous orders that went to Europe talking about equity and freedom, because no one was having those discussions back then. They were talking about equality in the sense that you were equal under the domination of your king or under your God. But it was not a society, an equitable society. So that was something unique in the Americas when they arrived here. And it really got a lot of philosophers talking in Europe because they had never seen it in action before.
Yes, and still racism being as insidious as it is, and supremacy and also greed and self-interest being as powerful as it is, it really didn't take long for many of those architects and philosophers to use intellectualism and throughout the Age of Enlightenment to service again the imperial expansion of Europe. And you look at, for instance, Descartes, who believed that non-Europeans, and we learn about many of these philosophers still today. If I was to, study social sciences, I'd learn about Descartes, I would learn about Locke, I would learn about Voltaire, I'd learn about their philosophies and how fundamental they are to my career. What I don't learn is that many of them were slave owners, many of them were also held stolen indigenous land, many of them carried out research like how to whip an African best, but not completely kill him, but strip him of his skin. Many of them, carried out horrible racist research and ultimately research and advanced theories that were just really in service of validating and legitimizing the ongoing imperial project, which many of them also had investments in as well. And it's a huge area for us to delve into, and a lot of the work that I do now within the sciences. So I do a lot of work with science and research units and institutions, and we discuss, well, this is what you learned in university, but did you also know about this other side of that story as well? And particularly because, the self-serving policies and the self-serving laws of colonial governments has often come from self-serving science of racist and imperial scholars, implicit or explicitly racist and self-serving science, based on a whole lot of racist and self-serving assumptions. And they call it evidence-based, that actually that whole system of academia and intellectualism needs to be critiqued. And I'm not saying it needs to be thrown out, but it needs to be critiqued for, its roots in imperialism as well.
That's a really important point. And I think other people, a lot of Indigenous people are moving into that, the scientific methodology and its racist roots. I mean, that's happening I'm thinking of Robin Kimmerer, for example, and traditional ecological knowledge and scientific ecological knowledge, and trying to put them in some kind of dialogue with one another, but you always end up that one dominates. Science always dominates this indigenous practice. So this is a whole other conversation in a way, but it's really important. I'm so glad you're into that now.
But then, like you often do, you then compare it also to individual salvation. Right. That's where it goes back to the major religions, where it becomes individualized through your personal salvation. And that becomes most urgent for your soul to be released after you die. And so it's another way of separating humanity from the natural world and that integrative, regenerative force that we're part of. We're not to ascend it. So those go hand in hand. And the doctrine of discovery is it's an easy discussion in relation to science when you just look at the languaging of science and scientific discovery, and in the same way in which they carried out geographic discovery of lands that were
not lost to us in the first place,
Right.
you often see them discovering new pieces of knowledge or information that were also not lost to us, that we have always known to be the case, but now it becomes legitimized. Now because it gets published in a white academic journal, it becomes legitimized and it can be utilized in different ways. But importantly, these things have direct lines to policy and legislation as well. And so, if research and evaluation are important parts of the policy and legislation cycle. And so, it's an urgent discussion for us in relation to the doctrine of discovery around the way in which it has infiltrated policy and evaluation cycles through research and science.
That's great. I do want to get to this brilliant piece that you wrote.
Right.
I want to sort of contextualize it a bit because, while our discussions around the doctrine of discoveries tend to focus on, the 1450s, the 1493, of course, and we just posted a new translation of Inter Caetera from 1493, which we've been working on. That's one of the things we're trying to do is retranslate some of these primary texts, and examine them from more of an indigenous perspective. Many of these translations have been done, 150 years ago by, church historians, essentially. So we're trying to take a new look, and some things are, some things can pop out of these texts, but one of the nuggets that you were able to help fill in for us is Sublimus Deus, which is what, 1537, I think, something like that.
Yep. Yes.
Which, and I think you introduce it saying that old chestnut, something, that this is all often rolled out as, proof that the Vatican had, sworn off of this kind of colonization project of the 15th century. In the 16th century, they were playing nice with everyone else. Steve Newcomb, of course, has addressed this in various ways, but I thought your piece really nailed down some new information about that. And I thought it was kind of brilliantly laid out. And I wondered if you could just kind of walk us through that, because as I understand it, even though Sublimus Deus was an attempt by some, sort of activist priests in Mexico at the time to try to push back against the abuses of colonialism, it was very short-lived, a year, and probably the die had already been cast by that point. As Steve points out, we're 45 years into the colonization project, and everything is already kind of set. So I wonder if you could just kind of walk us through that. So, because you have revealed these texts in a way that I find really, really important.
Sure. So, huge mihi also to Steve and the work that he does. He's so generous with his work, and he's such an important voice in this space. And it is really important to consider the context, the time and the context within which these documents came to be. And, many of your listeners might be familiar with the Franciscan monk Bartolomé de las Casas, who was called the champion of indigenous peoples, of course, and wrote his journals, which are often pored over by Doctrine of Discovery scholars, and provide a first-hand testimony of the atrocities that were visited upon indigenous peoples. Particularly, I know he was on the third of Columbus's voyages as well, but also actually he wasn't in excuse if I pronounce this properly, if I don't pronounce this properly, but he was a part of the encomiendo I'm terrible at the pronunciation. But he, there was the system that was set in place, the encomiendo, I think it was called, the encomiendo system, set in place to reward colonizing invaders with lands, but also native peoples to work those lands. So they were often enslaved as well. And it was at force, and it was very violent. And Bartolomé de las Casas was a part of that system for a little while, and then rejected it and started to try and push more for, actually, we should be looking to convert them to Christ, not to wage war upon them and enslave them and dispossess them. And he was one of the people who, in this journey of his, where he was trying to, and this is within a context of its own, of course, I'm mindful that he himself also held native slaves at the beginning, and also didn't believe in our ability to be able to hold on to our indigenous faith as well, that we should still be converted. But Bartolomé de las Casas lobbied essentially for us to, for indigenous peoples to not be enslaved, to not be dispossessed, to not have war waged upon us. And when he did that, that was really at what was the context for the development of Sublimis Deus. And Sublimis Deus was, along the general gist of it is that you should not be dispossessing these people. It did still hold within Sublimis Deus the imperative to convert, but it did say if they're not converted yet, you cannot enslave them and you cannot dispossess them. And so that was a success for them at the time. And this is a document that's often raised, I've heard it raised by the Catholic Church before and by other churches as well, to try and shut down the argument for repudiating the doctrine of discovery or rescinding the doctrine of discovery, if you're talking about the Vatican. And so alongside Sublimis Deus came almost like an administrative document as well, which was Pastoral Officium. And Pastoral Officium basically said, we have issued this papal, or this decree, this papal decree of Sublimis Deus, and here's the administration, here's how the administration of it will work out. And if there is anybody over in the Americas who is partaking in these activities, that they would be excommunicated from the church, and that their activities would be null and void. Now, if we look at that time, who did we have over there? We had Hernan Cortez in Mexico, who already held numerous silver mines and numerous resources and lands, and people serving him, native peoples serving him, that had been set up under that system, under the encomienda system. There we go. I'm getting my mouth around it now. And you also had Pizarro as well invading Peru. You had de Salazar as well over in Paraguay, and many of them were carrying out the directives of the Doctrine of Discovery of the previous papal bulls, which was to view indigenous peoples as enemies of Christ, and to wage war upon them, and to enslave them, and to dispossess them, and to turn them to your servitude for your use and profit, and all of their belongings as well, for your use and profit. So they were carrying that out, and they complained and aggressively lobbied against Sublimis Deus, and of course the administrative document that went with it, Pastoral Officium. And they were very offended by it, and so they lobbied Charles V, who was both the King of Spain and the Holy Emperor of Rome, to say, look, I mean, we're already in here, we're already doing this, and as Steve points out, we're already 40 years into this project. You can't just shut it down now. And it's really important that we look at it in that sense, that this was really about, for them, this was about defending the colonial project, the imperial project that had already been set in train. And they saw these tasks that were being ruled against as being fundamental fundamental to the carrying out, the enslavement and the dispossession and the harm and the acts of war were fundamental to them. And so they opposed being told, and this is what we can kind of break the argument down to, which is Bartolome de las Casas saying, no, the project of converting people to Christ can continue, which I don't agree with that either, but the project of that can continue, but it can continue without dispossession, without murder, without targeting women and children, and, you know, without the dispossession. And the argument back on that was, no, we need to do these things.
Do you need help catching up on today's topic? Or do you want to learn more about the resources mentioned? If so, please check our website at podcast.doctrineofdiscovery.org for more information. Now, back to the conversation.
So the, you know, the conquistadors really opposed sublimis Deus, and their argument was that no, these tasks, these acts that we're taking out are fundamental to the work that we have to do on behalf of the Holy Roman Empire, on behalf of the monarchs of Europe. And so they argued to have that. And I think it's really important for us to break it down, what exactly it was that they were arguing for. They were arguing for the continuation of these acts of violence and dispossession. And so within a year, through the lobbying of Charles V and through the lobbying of the conquistadors as well, they reversed it. They reversed it through nullifying the administrative document, Pastoral Officium, but they also made very clear statements that everything that they said in Pastoral Officium, which relates to and gives effect to sublimis Deus, everything that they said in that document is null and void, and basically undid it. And it's so interesting that when people raise sublimis Deus, they don't ever talk about the fact that within a year it was able to be effectively rescinded, when we have been working so long to get the papal bulls and the Doctrine of Discovery rescinded.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It occurs to me just as you're talking, and also reading your stuff, it occurs to me that, you know, they're met with a kind of peculiar challenge, right? So there's forced conversion from, you know, 1493, well, you know, with Cortez 1519, you know, into the 16th century, you know, for a long time. And as you were saying, the requerimiento is really, you know, convert or die kind of declaration that they read in a language that these indigenous peoples probably don't understand. But that's kind of the first wave of colonialism. What happens, of course, I mean, this is a standing question for me. I don't expect you to answer it, but what happens when you have to continually assault now Christian indigenous people, right? Presumably they've been converted, right? So that presumably they have been forcibly converted, you know, either alive or dead, I suppose, but they've been forcibly converted. So now those 15th century documents of when you enter the lands of non-Christian people, those lands automatically are deeded to the Christian conquerors. So what happens then when you're into the lands of these presumably Christian, I'll say that in scare quotes, right? These indigenous peoples who have been forcibly converted.
Yeah, and so I think it's actually one of the strong arguments on our side in relation to the Doctrine of Discovery, that it was absolutely an economic project, because even for those who were converted, the subjugation, the oppression, the dispossession never stopped. So it was never actually about bringing people to Christ. It was always a economic project of extraction from Indigenous bodies and Indigenous lands and waters. And that just happened to take the most legitimizing force, which at the time was Christianity, and Christianity still holds a particular role within that. But over time, the process through which they would achieve this economic project, it also morphed and diversified and became very sophisticated. So it took on the cloak of intellectualism. And we see that through the Age of Enlightenment. It took on the cloak of economics as well, through the global economic order as well, and international relations, and eventually jurisprudence as well. So I think the fact that we do see that even post conversion, our people were still oppressed is actually testament to the fact that it was never actually about bringing the lost lambs back to the flock of God. It was always about extraction from us and from our lands, which they continued to carry out regardless. And then I guess, some of the other aspects to consider in that space is that what the doctrine of discovery did was that it didn't just, it wasn't just about extracting, it didn't just accord rights in relation to lands, it set a power structure in place. And Christianity, of course, that power structure included divine power of God, was, the manifest destiny and the divine power of God, and then the Vatican, and then the monarchs of Europe as the administrators of the laws of the Vatican. But there was a very clear power structure, I often talk about, there's two kind of main tasks that they need to carry out in order to maintain this economic project. One is the setting up of a system so that you can protect the flow of privilege. So they need to set a system and a structure up. And that comes, of course, with military force and all of the different things. And then the second thing that they need to do is they need a narrative to legitimize the system that they set up. And that's really important for us to remember, even for our whānau who are converted, who do follow Christ. And I do believe in religious freedom. So I believe it's people's choices, what they, who they follow and what their faith is. But we have to remember that there are narratives in there around domination, and who has the ultimate authority to make laws and whose interests as well, and that it comes with it a prescriptive view of the universe and our role in the universe in relation to each other, in relation to Papatuanuku, our planet, and Ranginui, our Sky Father, and that's not something that can be isolatable. The Western European mindset is one that creates silos and categories with no crossover between them, and they disconnect it, and it's inherently disconnective. And I know, at least for our way of approaching things, prayer is science, and science is prayer, which is also related to our kai, our food, and we pray for our food, and also our food is a science as well, and our songs and our oratory and our art and how we name our babies and how we form our families and how we perceive these. These are deeply interconnected practices, which through European intellectual theory has become siloed out. And so I always call, re-indigenization and decolonization as a reconnective process. And a part of that reconnection is being able to identify and articulate the process of injustice that disconnected us from ourselves, from each other, and from the universe around us, so that we can identify the sites of reconnection and where we need to place our energy, and the approaches that we need to take as well. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
I'm not sure it did, but that is a lovely way to conclude this conversation with you, Tina. I really appreciate you and all the efforts you undertook to be with us today. And I don't know, I think we'll have to have you back at some future time. So thank
I'd love to sit and talk with you for hours, we don't. And there's one thing I have to say, I first became aware of the doctrine of discovery through going to the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues and sitting at the feet of our Haudenosaunee relations and hearing the amazing amount of work that you've done, that myself and Jacinta Dudu, our Pa Moana Jackson, who is my mentor throughout this, who delivered such a powerful panel and discussion at the 2012 Permanent Forum, who just passed away a few months ago, and we feel somewhat rudderless without him, I guess, to an extent. And so I just wanted to thank you for all of the work that you have all done in that space, and especially our Haudenosaunee relations. We don't have, outside of, I would say a handful of us who have largely been mentored by Moana, we don't have many people to talk about the doctrine of discovery with. So I'm always in a workshop space and teaching about it to people who have never heard about it before. Yeah. So it's really exciting for me to sit with people who are experts and discuss it with people who have their insights, and also be able to acknowledge the contributions that you've all made to this space, which we continue to benefit from. So thank you so much, all of you, Adam, Sandy, Phil, for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Oh,
Tina.
thank you. Thank you. Brilliant work. And
Yes.
I'm sure we'll hear much more from you in the future. So thanks very much. And we'll look forward to meeting again soon. Our condolences on the loss of your mentor.
Right.
Thank you.
I had heard about that, and I neglected to mention it at the beginning, but thank you for bringing it up.
Yes, no problem. Thank you. And yeah, we will be in touch soon, and I will send, I'm actually writing a piece on the doctrine of discovery in his tribute book. I've been asked to write the chapter on the doctrine of discovery for a book that's in tribute to him. So I'm working on that at the moment, and I will get your article, the article, over to you very soon as well. I'm working on that, and we'll touch base about the book that you're putting together as well.
Right. Well, when we have, so I think we're officially done, but anyway, but when we have you up, that's part of it, right? So we need to strategize on what we can do with this grant, and how we can make the biggest impact. Yeah. Because it's not just you and your communities and nations down there that really don't know much about the doctrine of discovery. It's we've had all these repudiations by various Christian groups, denominations, a variety of different religious organizations have repudiated it, but still, there's not much that people can draw on to educate their own constituencies, right? So that's kind of what we're working on too. What would be most helpful? What kind of writing? What kind of little pieces would be most helpful, to educate more and more people, and how, though, it connects to their current issues that are facing them right now. So, so when we have you here, we will strategize about all of that. Okay?
I think it would be fantastic if we can have a gathering.
Exactly.
And sit there with our brothers and sisters from Africa, and sit there with our brothers and sisters from Australia and South America, and all of. I think that would be
the UN is
really powerful.
The UN is lovely, but it's just always such a pressure, such a pressured thing, and we're thinking a conference would be much more, I don't know, we'd have more time to talk about, the real roots of this stuff. And we've talked to, so we might have a play. Someone has done a play called In the Courts of the Conqueror, a New York, an indigenous man from New York, and we met with him. So we might bring that up. We're going to have an art show, maybe a concert. So it's like we'll have all this stuff to bring more attention, nothing like the arts to bring more attention to these issues too. So
we do. We have we have one of our performers here who has been getting very politicized. He's been putting out a lot of work, and he's just recently released a song that makes reference to it, but he's also asked to sit with me so that he can learn more about it as well. Troy Kingy. We didn't get a chance to talk about the repudiation work that we're doing with the government at the moment.
Oh, right. That's right.
Really interesting that they're still at the table with us. The Crown Solicitor General is still at the table with us. Interesting back and forth that we're having with them. So they started off with the old, well, it's not relevant. And I said, excellent. So you can repudiate it and we can be out of here before lunchtime because it doesn't make a difference, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, hang on a second. We need to do some deeper digging. We need to do some more research on it. I said, okay, then you go and do some more research and figure out what side of the fence you're on and then come back to us and see how it goes. But basically for us, either your presence and authority is derived through the treaty, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or it is derived through the application of the doctrine of discovery. You decide what you want the basis of your authority to be on and let us know. And if it's going to be the doctrine of discovery, then let's just be upfront and say that.
Yeah, right.
And if it's not, then it should be no problem at all to repudiate it and reject it completely.
Yeah.
And so that's the space that we're in at the moment, and they are figuring out how to respond to that. And particularly we've grounded it as because they've committed to a national action plan against racism, and that was a part of the findings of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the Christchurch terrorism attacks.
Oh, wow.
So one of the recommendations was a national action plan against racism, and so we've grounded that national action of racism that non-negotiable is that they repudiate the doctrine of discovery because of its connections to our Muslim Islam relations who are present in those early papal bulls as well as Saracens. And so we've been in deep discussions around the way in which religious racism and the doctrine of discovery has impacted us alongside our Muslim communities as well, which has been an interesting result of the Christchurch Royal Commission of Inquiry. And interesting actually, because the terrorist, I don't know if you've seen or heard, but he issued a manifesto, right? And the manifesto is rife with crusade narratives. So he talks about the crusades. He talks about, what would the Pope do? Ask yourself, what would the Pope do? And he's got references. He in like a twink liquid paper drew references to the crusades on his gun that he used to shoot
Wow.
to shoot up the mosques. And so it's rife with crusade references. And so we've been in some deep learning spaces about that with our Muslim brothers and sisters. So a very interesting space that we're in right now in Aotearoa, and discussions that have just been long overdue. And Moana was very excited about the fact that we're finally opening up these discussions now.
And that's what I find, conversations around the doctrine of discovery are very edifying. I mean, they're clarifying, I mean, yes, it's horrible. It's not fun, but it is really clarifying for everyone involved, I mean, you could look at the age of discovery as essentially a crusade, or kind of trying to get to Jerusalem, get to their Holy Land, right? By conquering the rest of the world. Essentially, that's what it's about, right? It's a continuation of the Crusades. That's why there are Saracens and the enemies of Christ. I mean, that's kind of what the language that's being utilized. So
Yeah.
so it really is
Yep.
from the 11th century. It starts there and then it moves forward. Or you could say it starts in the 4th
Yes,
century.
let's start
At the
there.
beginning, the origins of the church with, Constantine,
Militarization.
and so it really is a long history that becomes current,
But
urgent.
it's become the model of how we think about the world. Everybody, it's this
Yeah, it is.
supremacist
And
way of thinking about
yes,
everything.
yes, it is. And also, Wana used to remind me that don't forget how ancient our ways are. Like that has been in place.
Exactly.
Yes, it's been in place for a few hundred years now,
Yeah.
but our ways of knowing, being, doing, and relating to each other and the universe has been around for millennia
Exactly.
before that.
That's
And
right.
so a part of the colonial fiction is that it's intractable because it's always, and it tries to fool everybody that this is the natural order of the universe, that this is how it's meant to
Right.
be. But actually, it's a
Hardly.
blip on the radar compared to Indigenous law and Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing, and relating to each other. And so it's absolutely retractable, and it's absolutely something within our power to be able to overcome. But it starts with these discussions. And you're so right, Phil. Like my experience overarchingly is that it's a healing process. And we talk about how healing journeys must begin with forums of truth. And I've seen, so for so many people that it relieves us of that burden or that wound that says that our oppression is happenstance within this broader, apparently beneficent, altruistic idea of spreading the word of God. But actually, no, there was intent. And when you can identify and highlight that intent, you realize your oppression is not happenstance, that you're not just a byproduct, that actually what happened to you was intentional, and also that there's nothing wrong inherently with you as an Indigenous person, that you are subjected to a process that many others were subjected to with an ends in mind. And that's where you can really take a big step in the healing journey, decolonization healing journey. So yeah, I totally see it as a healing process.
Right.
And I also, I think that what's being revealed now is how weak this way of operating is in the world, right? How unviable or inviable or something, how
degenerative.
Yeah, how limited it is in terms of giving our children a viable future, where as I say, Indigenous peoples had to have peace traditions around the world because they were in the same place for millennia, for so long. They needed peace traditions. They weren't warring traditions, as is usually as they're usually stereotyped as. But right.
Well,
that's right. And
written. And that's again going back to the doctrine of discovery, because they had the Jesuit relations, the Jesuits were only sending these reports back to the monarchs. They were publishing them as periodicals in France for the public to read.
Wow.
So that's the history. Those are the primary sources that everyone's been basing their history on regarding the Haudenosaunee. And give me a break. I mean, you read them.
And what was happening with the records of Cook and his crew from the Endeavour that were getting sent back to Europe? Yeah. Those were being used as themes in brothels for these orgies, essentially. And they were making pornographic periodicals out of the lascivious, promiscuous, dusky Pacific maiden trope. Good. And we became the subjects of early not early, the earliest pornography is in ancient Rome, but of colonial pornography in Europe, which Voltaire used to engage in as well. And there's records of him engaging in the discussions around our people in that way. But that's where you see again that objectifying of Indigenous women and the turning us into these commodities, which was also you have a look even at some of those Elvis movies and the way that Hawaiian women are portrayed, and
Oh, yes.
the
Well,
tiki lounge, all of these things, that we are these accessible, sexually accessible, dusky South Sea maidens that can be taken and used while military men are in the R&R, are taking R&R, and all of that has a history back to Cook and his records and how they were represented in Europe as well. So yeah, very, very interesting. Look, we could talk for days, couldn't we?
We could, yeah. So Tina, how can students and others listen, connect, and follow what you do?
So I have a blog site, which is tinangata.com. So tinangata.com, and a lot of my blog pieces and an archive are available on there. You can also download my book, Kia Mau, Resisting Colonial Fictions, from my website there as well. You can also get that book on hard copy from Unity Bookshop in Wellington, New Zealand, and they ship internationally. I have a podcast, What a Load of Colony, podcast on Spotify as well, and iHeartRadio, so you can access it. You can access it there as well.
The producers of this podcast were Adam DJ Brett and Jordan Brady Lowen. Our intro and outro is Social Dancing Music by Oris Edwards and Regis Cook. This podcast is produced in collaboration with the Henry Luce Foundation, Syracuse University's Department of Religion, and the Indigenous Values Initiative.